Black Americans disproportionately affected by police violence. It's happening across the country and here in Wisconsin.
You don't want to see one more black man who is, it's not only a difficult engagement, but shot 7 times in the back.
A year of protests, unrest, and calls for justice. Tonight, WISN 12 News is partnering with Oscar winner John Ridley and No Studios.
It's about people listening, it's about people engaging, it's about people being empathetic and really working towards solutions.
Right now, a WISN 12 Project Community Special, a panel on community and policing.
And good evening, I'm Derek Rose. We are honored here at 12 News to partner with No Studios and its Social Justice Summit. This panel on community and policing is also streaming live right now on WISN.com, the 12 News mobile app, and at NoStudios.com. First, for tonight's discussion, let's hear from No Studios founder, Academy Award winner, and Wisconsin native John Ridley.
Derek, it's very good to see you again, and my thanks to you for moderating this panel and to everyone at WISN for being part of this discussion. For me, social justice is about the ability to see ourselves in other people. And that includes being able to have sometimes difficult discussions, sometimes painful discussions. But if we don't all work together, then we're all working in opposition. And I think we've seen particularly over the last year that really gets us nowhere. So I'm very excited about the upcoming panel on policing and community. I'm so grateful to everyone who has chosen to join in these conversations. And I also want to encourage people to follow our Social Justice Summit this weekend, where I'll have a conversation with Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, as well as Dr. Yusef Salaam, one of the exonerated 5 from New York City. And you can follow all that, as you say, at nostudios.com. So Derek, again, my thanks to you and my thanks to everyone at WISN for amplifying our message on being together in the communal experience.
All right. Thank you very much, John Ridley. And we want our guests to have as much time to speak as possible. So let me introduce our panel really quickly. First, there's Faith Kohler. She's an attorney and former federal agent who is now a filmmaker and visual artist. Also tonight joining us is Chris Wilson, who splits his time between Baltimore, Maryland and New York City and works as a visual artist and social justice advocate. And we have Brady Anderson, a civil rights lawyer and former prosecutor who has practiced both in Wisconsin and in Oklahoma, where he was the legal director for the ACLU. Also joining us tonight is Jamal Smith, an activist who also works in the City of Milwaukee's Office of Violence Prevention. And finally tonight we have Michael Brunson. He started with Milwaukee Police in 1995 and is currently serving as the acting chief of police here in the city of Milwaukee. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us tonight, and I want to get right to our first topic. I want to start with the idea of systemic racism. Author Robin DiAngelo wrote a book called White Fragility: Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. Last week, she told our own Soledad O'Brien, quote, "It is about power. It is about one group's collective bias. We all have bias, but when our group's collective bias is backed with legal authority and institutional control, that transforms it into systemic racism." So to our panel, let's discuss, is there systemic racism? How does it affect policing? And how is it unlearned or dismantled? Don't all jump in at once.
Well, I can go Jamal Smith again from the Office of Violence Prevention. When I hear this question, it kind of reminds me of the line from New Jack City when Ice-T was asked, was Nino Brown a part of the CMB? And when he said, "Can Michael Jordan slam dunk?" It's kind of similar to that of saying, absolutely, there is an existence of systemic racism. Listen, we can't sit here and have a conversation about systemic racism and make it seem as if this is not problematic. To me, what would be the point of a social justice summit if there's no such thing as racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia? These are all real concepts that really exist and are problematic today. So when we look at examples of systemic racism, we can look right here in Milwaukee, right? We talk about the report from the 24/7 Wall Street that says that of the 5 five cities that are the worst for Black folks in this country. Two of them reside right here in Milwaukee. In Wisconsin. Number one is Milwaukee, and number two is Racine. Right. So we have to understand the impact of systemic racism and how it plays a role. Let's talk about a couple instances within how systemic racism plays a role. One, we could talk about home ownership, right? We have to understand that Associated Bank was required to pay $200 million for discriminatory lending practices, and Wisconsin was one of those states. We realized that Black home ownership right here in the city of Milwaukee is under 10%. Right? That's systemic racism. When we talk about healthcare, when there's a conversation about how doctors have prescribed painkillers less for Black patients than they have for white patients, because historically it is of a belief that Black patients have a higher pain tolerance than white patients, right? Or when we talk about employment, right, where resumes with ethnic names, my name is Jamal, right? Resumes with ethnic names are declined or discarded at a higher rate than those that are considered regular because of the fact of a cultural fit, right? Or feeling as if the historical mindset is that Black folks are lazy, which is ridiculous given the fact that Black folks were the face of this country and the reason why this country actually exists based on our labor. So when we talk about systemic racism, we have to look at that power and who it benefits. And who it benefited, the people who it benefited don't look like me. They don't have my face. They don't have my skin color. They look different than me. So systems have been in place, and that's what we try to really elevate within the Office of Violence Prevention. When we look at violence, we look at it from a public health aspect and not just the conversation about interpersonal or communal violence, but how do we look at systems, structures, institutions, and how they have been very much complicit and responsible for a lot of violence that has existed as well. So when we talk about even the impact of poverty that exists right here in Milwaukee, Mahatma Gandhi said poverty is the worst form of violence. But we understand that there's concentrated poverty within communities of people that look like me, in marginalized, disenfranchised communities. So we have to be honest in our conversation. If there's going to be any change, we first have to be honest in the existence of the violence that has happened systemically, structurally, institutional wide, and systemic racism is indeed a problem. So then also when you talk about how that looks in policing, we are looking at how policing impacts or how that comes on, looking at ways in which social issues are being more policed, more so than we talk about behavioral, right? So people are being policed in disenfranchised communities more so because of systems that have been in place and policies that have been in place. So we look at the people who are impacted by systems more than we look at the systems themselves.
I'm going to jump into and address just how does that look in policing? You know, I come from a background in law enforcement and I'm also an attorney. And when I look at the economic disparities, when I look at the disadvantages in some communities versus others, and I ask the question, how does it affect policing? I think we have heard a lot recently in the wake of some of these police shootings where people say, oh, that officer was a bad apple. And I go back to the analogy of an apple and say, well, if it's a bad apple, is it a bad barrel? If it's a bad barrel, is the orchard diseased? Because I think what we're looking at in terms of systemic problems with policing, yes, stems from racism. I think some of it stems from perhaps a disconnect with the disparities, the poverty, and the impact of all of those disparities on behaviors, on communities. And I feel like, in essence, when we look at how do we unlearn that or dismantle it, one of the questions I ask when I see implicit bias training being offered to police departments, I think, well, perhaps it's a good start, but how well is inherent bias training going to work if the system itself is inherently racist? And so I think the dilemma is we do have to not necessarily unlearn, we have to understand the disparities and where they come from. We have to acknowledge them, yes, as Jamal said, but I also think that we have to break this apart and see what communities actually need in policing versus what we as a society have been giving them with policing. And I think that's a big problem that I hear in a lot of the interviews I've been doing for my most recent exhibit, Salvage, is understanding community perceptions about policing. And the biggest thing that I hear, the strongest denominator in these interviews that I've been doing is many people in our disadvantaged communities don't feel as though anyone's asked them what they need. And when they do need something, where is there to call? Resources are scarce. The police become the first responders for pretty much any social problem that ends in a glaring need and a call to someone. And I think that's how we've ended up with police responding to homelessness, to mental health crises, domestic violence. These are issues that are systemically broken and have gone systemically not addressed in a way that's really brought constructive and sustainable solutions to the people who are impacted by them. So I would say that's how it affects police, is police are wholly unprepared to address the social issues that are causing calls for police service in their communities.
Chief Brunson, do you agree with that police departments are unprepared in addressing these kinds of issues?
Well, I think what has happened over time is that when there's no other entities that can address problems, then police are there 365 days out of the year, 24/7. And so what has happened is that police have been called and their role has been broadened so much that that is the first thing that people think of when they need assistance, no matter what the problem is. And so what that has created is a situation in which police are obviously in demand because they are the social entity that is always there. And so it's easy sometimes for people to pick up the phone and dial 911 and have the police come and address a problem. And so you have a situation, as described previously, where although police are trained for a number of things, they're called to things that maybe there is another social structure that would better handle that particular problem or situation.
All right, thank you. I want to switch our topic now to the issue of transparency. George Floyd's death in Minneapolis puts a spotlight on this topic specifically. The Washington Post reported the initial statements from Minneapolis police did not mention that an officer knelt on Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes. Police only noted Floyd, quote, appeared to be suffering medical distress. In Wauwatosa, during protests after an officer was cleared in the shooting of a teen at Mayfair Mall, the police department and the chief initially only shared self-produced videos on social media in an environment where no questions could be asked. It was 5 days until the chief took direct questions on camera. So my question to the panel, is law enforcement transparent enough with the community, and is the community understanding and patient enough?
I think I might jump in on this one and say, frankly, it's often no to both. The reality is that I think in a couple of ways, right, we have had a problem with transparency in law enforcement for as long as we have scrutinized law enforcement. And that goes back to really the bad role that police have to play here. And going back to what we were talking about a moment ago, we have a system where we've been developing, a systemically racist society in America, really throughout Western culture for probably about 900 to 1,000 years, give or take. That takes a while and it creates some serious systemic issues. Well, law enforcement's very role is to protect and preserve a system, right? It's to conserve things, it's to protect things. It's not necessarily to change things. So law enforcement's going to be that first flashpoint, which means it's going to have an incredible amount of scrutiny. And unfortunately, we're seeing problems on both sides. I absolutely see rushes to judgment, and I've probably been guilty of rushes to judgment. And yet I've also seen incredible examples just in these last few months even of incredible amounts of false statements, of misleading statements by law enforcement, of things that seem designed at times to obfuscate the truth, to literally get people out in the streets rather than keep them from, whether that's things like, Kenosha even making up a curfew that never existed and they're still prosecuting people for it, or whether it's the Wauwatosa video of the bicyclist arrest that seems to completely contradict what law enforcement says, or whether it's right back to innumerable killings, innumerable murders like that of George Floyd, where we were told initially as a public that wasn't a murder. It was just an officer-involved shooting. It was just a tragedy. And we have to find out later that that's the case. One of the things I found in working with law enforcement for years and members of the public is that both the rise in transparency and the ability of people to give law enforcement, in a sense, the deference they feel they need, or at least be able to listen, go hand in hand. And it's when they break down, it's very hard to be able to actually rebuild the two without being able to really address both almost simultaneously. And that's really the challenge I think we face now.
So I would like to second what you said, and coming in from Baltimore City, I think back to 2015 with the death of Freddie Gray, when all of the cameras, the whole world was focused on Baltimore. And, I was, I guess, naively optimistic that there would be some change in our city. And, there was a lot of investigations. We uncovered a lot of corruption within the police department here in Baltimore. However, those officers were not charged, or they were charged, but they were not convicted for the murder of Freddie Gray. And then also, there still has not been any transparency on holding police accountable for, when they're accused of things. And so, I think that's a big problem, and it's something that we're not talking about enough.
I'm going to tack on to that too. Thank you, Chris, for bringing that up, because one of the things that I think the public sometimes doesn't see is the need for due process. When a police officer is involved in an incident, it says, as Brittany was saying before, there are administrative violations that they could get fired for. There are potential criminal charges that they could get charged with. But I think one of the biggest sticking points that I've had with some of these incidents where police have actually caused the death of citizens during an in custody or custodial experience is, if that's how they're trained, if they're following what they were trained to do, if there's a reasonable belief, like if their department hasn't banned chokeholds, and they're technically just following what they were taught to do, it puts a monkey wrench in the system for accountability. And to me, it comes back to, we need to actually excise the problematic laws. We need to excise the problematic regulations, go back and take a look at how it is that over all these years, from Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, I look at these things and I say, it's what happened isn't right morally. It may have been justified legally. It might even sometimes thinly pass muster to keep someone their job. But when we know it at their heart that these killings are morally not right, what are we doing to go back and change the laws so that these loopholes don't exist and we actually can have true accountability, starting with what the law says? Because I feel like that's really what is so problematic in the whole notion of giving officers due process and doing these investigations, is there's so many technicalities where they might be in bounds that, to me, it says the problem is the system.
And if I can just comment really quick on that, honestly, we live in an era where you can be fired quickly for an email as a police officer than you can for actually killing someone. When we look at what happened with Eric Gardner in 2014 and the chokehold, when he said, "I can't breathe," that was a legal chokehold, right? So we really have to look at the process and the policies that exist that allow for the autonomy that happens within policing. And when we really examine and analyze and juxtapose the ways in which the response happens towards policing, we have to understand that when it comes to that whole idea of transparency, the first thing is we got to be honest in recognizing how there are policies, to the previous panelist's point, there are policies that are on board that allows for some things to happen in the manner that they do, and it shouldn't be as such, right? So we have to be willing to bring about that challenge for reform to make sure that when we talk about protect and serve, that's exactly what the focus should be, is protecting and serving. And then the whole aspect of due process, right? It's not the responsibility of an officer to be judge, jury, and executioner, right? The whole thing that we should be focusing on is due process. Let's just be transparent here. Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the most notorious serial killers here in Milwaukee. And I'm just going to say globally, and he got a trial, right? But when we look at what happened in terms of Jacob Blake, that's a whole different response. So when we look at Jay Anderson or Andreas Gonzalez or Joel Acevedo right here, that's a whole different response, right? And they were victims. So we got to understand, really, when we have this approach in terms of policing, we got to be willing to really call out the elephant in the room. And sometimes that's going to be uncomfortable. But my statement to that, when it comes to discomfort, is get comfortable being uncomfortable, because these conversations are necessary.
And Chief Brunson, he mentioned the Joel Acevedo case that happened here in Milwaukee, and you being the acting Milwaukee chief, I wanted to get you in on this topic of transparency, and for you and the department, the balance of providing as much information as you can to the public, accurate information, but also protecting the investigation. How is that balance handled in the department?
Yeah, obviously it's a delicate balance. We want to make sure that the investigation are functioning the way that they are supposed to, so that individuals will get a fair trial, so that there will be no reasons for a mistrial, or for, in the case of, let's say, an employee action, we have a standard operating procedure that we follow. In addition to that, there are open records laws too that we have to follow. And so we want to make sure that we do not do anything that's going to violate those things, because we don't want a verdict to be overturned, for example, or to impact what may happen later. So we always have to be careful of those things. I know that across the country, we see incidents that occur in different municipalities. And we see that sometimes chiefs, for example, are able to fire those individuals almost immediately. However, in Wisconsin, specifically Milwaukee, we do have due process for officers. We have to follow our standard operating procedures. If we don't do that, then we give cause for an individual to come back and to potentially be reinstated. So we always have to be careful in going through that due process. One of the things that I always want to try to be is transparent. However, I'm always mindful of that process, because I don't want a decision that I make to be overturned due to us not following the standard operating procedures and the laws that are in place. So it's always a balancing test.
Yeah.
And I want to follow up real quickly, Chief Brunson, because I know you are always accessible at crime scenes. I want to thank you for that when there's a situation here in Milwaukee. And something, and I know you put to your officers to say when you have a press conference, is that the information we are releasing is preliminary. How often do you see that preliminary information not be accurate as you thought it was when you released it initially?
Oh, that's quite frequent, that as you dig more into a situation, you find additional facts, you find additional witnesses, you find additional physical evidence that you didn't know initially. And that's why I always try to say that this is preliminary information, and that we will provide more information as we develop it. So that's part of it too, as far as not wanting to give out false information, because initially you might have an inkling of what occurred, but you don't have all the facts.
And if information does change, Chief, how do you handle when you would get an accusation from members of the public saying, "Oh, they weren't telling the truth from the beginning"? When in cases the information that changed the initial information may not have been intentionally misleading?
Well, we try to definitely follow up and make those corrections as quickly as possible. It can be a press release at times. I mean, if it's a very serious situation, we can do a press conference, but we do try to correct that record to the best of our ability, even using our social media pages and things of that nature to correct the record, because we want to be accurate. You're right. I mean, once you lose credibility with the public, then it's very hard to regain that.
Yeah.
And for the rest of our panel, if you see that situation where information does in fact change, how do you trust the police department? How does that conversation go in the community?
Well, for a long time, you don't trust them. That's the exact problem. Is you don't. You stop, and the question becomes, for how long? How long does it take to rebuild that trust? And in fact, I think that's one of the most important things to train officers and leaders in law enforcement in, is exactly that. That, okay, if you're going to say something misleading, if you're going to try to bend the truth, so to speak, don't just think about the consequences for you. Think about the consequence for every other law enforcement officer who is ever going to encounter any of the people who will hear your lie, because they will never be treated the same way. So much of what's going on in terms of the breakdown of policing and public relations right now is very much about trust, and neither side being in a position to as much trust the other. And that has an impact in every police encounter every day that is repeated thousands and tens of thousands, and nationally hundreds of thousands of times. And if you repeat it enough and both sides say, gosh, I don't quite trust you, I'm not quite sure if you have my best interest at heart. So if I'm the officer, maybe my hand's a little closer to my gun. If I'm the member of the public, maybe I'm doing something that's not very smart. Maybe I'm a little closer to running or for going for a weapon or that kind of thing. When we have that happen, eventually it produces a breakdown that inherently is going to make violence happen. It's going to make tragedies happen. And sometimes that's going to be measured ultimately in citizens who literally lie dead, who are tragically killed, and sometimes with officers. But I think that trust issue has a direct relationship with all of those encounters that we repeat thousands of times a day. Every traffic stop, every Terry stop, as we say as lawyers, right? Every time an officer comes up to somebody and says, what's going on? I need to see your identification, that kind of thing.
Sorry to cut you off here, Brady.
And that's going to be an issue.
Sorry to cut you off, Brady, but we have to take a quick break. We are out of time for this half hour, but our conversation continues online. Our community and policing panel discussion is streaming online for another half hour. Just log on to WISN.com or our 12 News Facebook page to continue watching this conversation.